Hi, everyone. So today we're going to do another video to help you really think about how you can best express the learning that you've done for the information in class when we get to those bigger assessments like midterms and finals. So a lot of times when I talk to students about taking assessments like midterms and finals, they say, I don't test well. And you know what? We've all been there, and it's a real bummer, and tests are stressful. And it turns out that the fact that tests like midterms and finals are really stressful is actually really unfortunate for our ability to demonstrate our mastery of material, because we know that when people are experiencing stress responses, that the portion of your brain that's involved in problem solving and rational thought kind of shuts down, and your more core processes associated with survival take over. But those core portions of your brain associated with fight or flight and survival are not the portions of your brain that are good for problem solving, which are exactly the portions of the brain that you need for taking a test. So one of the ways that I like to manage test taking anxiety is by having a process that I can fall back on so that I can work my way through tests methodically and work my way through questions methodically so that I kind of get rid of all of the chaos feeling associated with being stressed out while you're taking a test. So what I'm going to do is give you some of my tips and tricks for establishing a process for taking tests so that you can get rid of some of that really stressful, chaotic feeling where you're not sure what you've thought before and you're having a hard time keeping track of information. Okay. So generally what we're going to talk about is time management and then information management to help you decrease the mental processing power that you are using at any one time so that you can more efficiently solve problems. So the first thing that I want to mention that's pretty basic is time management. When you think about time dedicated to each question, if you divided out the total amount of time per question, you could figure out exactly how many minutes on average you have to answer each question. Now, of course, some questions are going to take longer or shorter depending on how easy that question is or how well prepared you are for that material. For your first time through on a test, my recommendation is that if you find yourself feeling really uncertain and like you might not be able to answer a question right off the bat, on your first run through of that test, skip it outright. Mark it to come back later, but don't spend too much of your time up front doing it. A lot of times for students with poor time management skills, what happens is that they get stuck on a small number of questions really early on in the test, and then they manage to work their way through them and do a good job. But because they've spent so much time working on early questions, by the time they get to questions later on that might have been pretty easy for them because they were well prepared, they end up not having nearly enough time to work through those and not getting points they otherwise could have gotten. So test taking strategy number one with time management is get the points that are easy for you first. The questions that are multiple choice are all worth the same amount, whether they're easy for you or hard for you. So you might as well get yourself the guaranteed easy points the first time through, and then come back to the hard questions that you may or may not get right because they're more challenging to begin with. All questions that are multiple choice are worth the same, so you might as well get the guaranteed points first. So that's the time management portion of things. The rest of my tips for taking tests are associated with the ability to clarify your mental processing of questions so that you're not trying to keep track of too many concepts in your head all at the same time. One of the things that I talk about in class is to do your brain a favor and not make it hold on to lots of different information all at once by essentially doing an info dump in the form of writing and visualizing what the question is asking you. So that's what we're going to talk about now. For your midterms and finals in this class, you are welcome to have scrap paper that we will provide for you. When you get that scrap paper, if there are any particularly challenging equations or definitions, I recommend that you immediately write them down on that scrap paper. Particularly for our more challenging concepts, like for example, heritability, it's really important to be able to check your thinking relative to a surefire 100% correct definition of a given term. By giving yourself that written version of a term definition, you're no longer comparing an answer option in your head with a definition that you're also holding in your head. The more things that your brain has to process simultaneously with no visual aids, the less effective you're going to be at problem solving. If you've got a definition down on paper, all of a sudden, the only thing you're holding in your head is how that definition applies to an answer prompt that you're looking at. It gives your brain less to do, so your brain can work more effectively. Okay, similar for equations, dump it all down. The other thing that I would really recommend you do as you're working through questions is draw out your thought process. If you're struggling to identify a correct answer, then give yourself that mental processing help like we do in class with all of the visual aids. One of the biggest tips that I want to give you all for working through questions, particularly multiple choice questions, is taking all of those suggestions that we just made and then applying it to a stepwise process of elimination for the answer options that you might have. And the way that we're going to think about that, excuse me, is that I'm going to briefly share my screen and talk you through how I go about answering complex questions. I've pulled up an example from one of our midterm practices associated with heritability, which is traditionally one of the very hardest concepts that we have in our class that people tend to really struggle with. So like I said, if I'm trying to think about heritability, the first thing that I do is think, okay, what's heritability mean? And what are the terms associated with that? So on my piece of paper, I would say heritability, and then I'd write out that definition, the proportion of phenotypic variation in a population due to genotypic variation in the population. I'd get that written down. Then I would think, okay, what are the terms that are relevant for that? And I'd jot down V sub E, V sub G, and V sub P. I'm doing a heritability specific example here, but this applies to whatever the question is. If it's about mutations, jot down the definition of mutation. If it's about distinguishing between evolutionary mechanisms, jot down the definitions of whatever those mechanisms are. Once you've got your initial starting point for information that would be helpful to visualize while answering the question, the next thing that I like to do is literally write down letters that correspond to the answer options on my pad of paper. So I literally on my scrap paper for every single question will write out letters for how many answer options there are, A, B, C, D, and E. What I do at that point is take each individual answer option and look at it individually, treating it as a true-false statement. If I can falsify any portion of a statement, one, based on my pre-existing knowledge, or two, if it's inconsistent with the information in the question prompt, then I can get rid of it. So let's think about how we could do that for this question. Like I said, the key here is to focus on one answer option and one answer option only and see if you can falsify any portion of it. So what we're going to do right now is think only about answer option 1, or A, as I've got it on my scrap paper. So it says another population of crows may have a heritability greater than 0 for feather color. So I think about heritability and realize it's a population level term. I think about the idea that different gene pools in different populations may have some genotypic variation that drives phenotypic variation in this population, and that would give them a higher heritability. So what I do for now is I say, yep, check mark by A. I could not falsify any portion of that statement. So now it stays. Then I move on to B, and I ignore every single other answer option. I don't have to remember that A is correct because I've already indicated that on my scrap paper. So I move on. I delete A from my mind because I've already got all the information I need about that on my scrap paper. So I can focus all my mental processes on assessing option B and only option B. All individuals of this population have identical alleles for feather color. Okay, so let's think a little bit about this one. The character feather color has a heritability of 0. Given this, is option B correct? Well, if heritability is 0, then I know that means there's no phenotypic variation due to genotypic variation. So one way that that could happen is if everybody has identical alleles. So I can't falsify that one either. That makes really good sense. One way that this population could have a heritability of 0 for feather color is if everyone is genotypically identical, and therefore there's no phenotypic variation due to genotypic variation. That gives me a heritability of 0. So now for option B, I say, cool, couldn't falsify that one either. I do not have to remember that A and B are correct because I've already got that on my paper. I don't have to take up any brain processing power to keep track of that. I've got it on my paper. I give my brain a break. Now I move on to option 3. The phenotypic variation for feather color in the population with a heritability of 0 would be less than in a population with a heritability of more than 0. So for this one, what I would probably do is give myself a nice little visual helper. And I would say, okay, I know that heritability is equal to V sub G over V sub P, or heritability is equal to V sub G over V sub G plus V sub E. So I would jot down my little equation there to help me think things through. And I would say, okay, if I've got heritability of 0, then I know V sub G has got to be equal to 0. But does that mean that it tells me how much V sub P is? Could I have equally low V sub G's, but still have more phenotypic variation? And at that point, what I would say is, well, even if my heritability is 0, I know that you can have phenotypic variation from V sub E. So just because heritability is 0 and V sub G is 0 doesn't mean that phenotypic variation is 0. So I can't use heritability as a proxy for phenotypic variation, because even with a heritability of 0, there might be tons of phenotypic variation due to environmental effects. So for this one, I would say, no, that is not a correct answer. I can falsify that. And I scratched it out on my list. Now, if this was just a regular multiple choice question with distinct answer options for everyone, at this point, I would just use this system until I've only got one that I haven't been able to falsify. But this is a particularly handy for questions that generally give students a lot of trouble, which is the 2 of the above and the all of the above. If you ignore the 2 of the above and the all of the above, and instead just focus on whether you can falsify the actual content statements, at that point, the 2 of the above and the all of the above sort themselves out for you. When I look at my list, I can see, no, I falsified option C, so all of the above can't be right. I couldn't falsify options A and B, so for this question, 2 of the above must be correct. So to recap, generally what I recommend when you're approaching multiple choice questions, for every single one, write out letters to represent each answer option, A, B, C, D, E, however many letters you've got. Once you've done that, look at each answer option individually and completely forget about the others. You need to dedicate all your brain power to a single problem at hand. Then either falsify or fail to falsify each of the answer options. Note what happened each answer option you work through. Then at the end, and only at the end, figure out what that falsification or lack thereof tells you about the correct answer. And again, I recommend doing this for every single question. So after I was done with this question, what I would do is literally scratch all that out and I would write it all over again for the next question. So when I move on to my next multiple choice, I start fresh, processing things one step at a time, giving a visual record of the mental work I've already done. It is a much more iterative, logical, predictive process that lets you sort through the panic that happens when you get really stressed out about a test. It also means that your brain is attempting to do fewer tasks at a time, and we know human brains are on average really bad at multitasking. So the fewer tasks you force your brain to engage in at any given time, the better. So hopefully those will be helpful tips for you as you're processing your way through midterms or finals and thinking your way through the most effective test-taking techniques. And as always, remember during the final, please ask as many questions as you want. The worst thing that can happen, like I always say, is I say, sorry, you need to know that, I can't help you with that. And you're no worse off than you were before. The best thing that can happen is you get the information you need to demonstrate your mastery of the material and you get a better score on the test. I will never get mad at you for asking questions. That is literally my job. My job is to give you an environment where you can pick up the tools of one and demonstrate what you can do with them. So please always feel free to ask questions. It is literally what I'm there for. I hope you all have a really good rest of your day, and I'll see you later in class.